Hello everyone, this is your second place gamer here, more like a dedicated forum dweller. For a start, not even sure why I chose this nickname for this video or maybe channel, but for the sake of those curious out there, my gaming background, my Battle.net and profile nickname is Lostario. And yet, being playing lots of games, Blizzard games, throughout what I'm assuming my first half of my life, and really sucked most of the time, but perhaps even being addicted at times. Before going further and giving my overall thoughts for Diablo 4, I'll attempt to give you one potential reason to why you might endure this terrible voice and pronunciation of mine. So I'll start with this hot take of mine. Despite loving games and having played lots of them, I'm actually not as much of an ARPG lover. Yes, I think that ARPGs as a genre and perhaps not heading in the right and greatest direction possible. And there are being some negative trends that somehow and some way each new producer and designer of games seems to go along with. But, as the title says, and may have suspected already, this analysis will be focused on Diablo 4 as a game. And in order to do the full circle analysis, I'll start from bits of the human nature itself. A soured milk, or more precisely being ground up with initially sweet but souring over time, is the concept of previous experiences with partial success leading towards a future of failure, often directed by badly defined expectations and badly formed criteria based on situational backgrounds, and perhaps even having a badly formed vision for the future. I believe this can happen more often than people think. However, it does not always end up in total disaster. I mean, I guess failing upwards it's not that rare occurrence, but as far as Diablo 4 was concerned, didn't slip it and it backfired. In general, the direction and perhaps even I would say obsession of strong preferences for marketable values, presentable identity as immediately possible, may have done the biggest blow to Diablo 4. Yes, I'm ready to argue that every single day of the week, that advertising machinery that did the biggest blow to the product when it comes to Diablo 4.
Part 1. Blizzard at fault. Now, Diablo 4 did not start out of the blue, and there was some history behind. But I'll still rest my case of that the need to represent repeatable marketable value, presented mostly easily recognizable and powerful demonstrations, has finally taken the toll over this time. The pursuit for spectacularity and attention, the notion of having every presented part feel perfect, attractive, loud, buzzing and spectacular, IMO has led the marketing team and developing team therefore under pressure to cut corners at times. Those have ended up polluting games with those bits of representable valued powers, and leaving behind perhaps really big parts of unfinished, unresolved, unaccounted for on the longer run. I'll consider Diablo 4 has suffered from previous games in that regard. Those that have played Heroes of the Storm, for example, are familiar with kind of seemingly harmless practice in which the new shiny thing almost always getting out of the line. The problem isn't that this may happen here and there. The problem is that this kind of practice felt like becoming a rule as the game progressed over time. And regarding HOTS, I'll briefly also mention one more parallel, difference from Diablo 4. In Heroes of the Storm, each game was its own thing, its own story, own dynamic, own plot, success, failure, excitement and frustration. Diablo 4 as opposed to that might be defined as one big Heroes of the Storm single player unbalanced experience for much longer, arguably for up to 3 months. So perhaps a bit exaggerated, but still it's not entirely out of perception that if you want to analyze Diablo 4 frustration and measure it, imagine playing one single Heroes of the Storm game for 3 months. That is what Diablo 4 in a nutshell inevitably becomes. Weird sources of power like renown that a casual person may not entirely complete before moving forward, or blatantly unaccounted ones that make the same regular, everyday, normal, casual if you like player to really hate their life. Perhaps Diablo 4 isn't a pay to win material, but it surely gives those do this new shiny thing or else vibes. And I'll talk about the reasons for this in more depth below, but for now, let's take a look at these two videos in parallel I have prepared for now. Copyright laws. Well, you get the idea though. I mean, look at the difference. It's not even in the same planetary system, yet alone in stratosphere. And I'm even gonna say that aside from having the barber's cart equipped versus not equipped, the gear on the left is actually better. The fight on the right has a couple of items quickly cooked and not even leveled up to a proper manner. Now, let's remember shortly that things like this, even in this early phase of the game, I mean Season 2 hasn't even started, and we already quite a bit of history here. First, there was the whirlwind being blatantly ridiculously overpowered. Then there was the near permanent unstoppable for druid and barbarian builds that were super obvious would take quite the hit. Then, during the preseason, there was the vulnerable and critical multiplying each other to double-digit totals. And now in Season 1 there is yet another example of this kind of obvious, blatant source of unbalanced power. And this time actually I'll say it's disrespectful toward the player base and the player's effort to create a meaningful and realistically strong and realistically struggling characters. Notice that when I talked about these things, I didn't talk of them from perspective of buffs or nerfs. They're a mean to achieving something bigger, greater, and more important. Namely, I focused on the concept of having the game both demand as well as respect players' efforts for progression. That is what is more important. The game should both demand as well as respect your effort. No cheap shot mechanics and no cheap sources of power. And no, I disagree with those that claim that sources of such IMO undeserved power is providing fun. It is not. Speaking of which, I'll now focus from the other side of the coin and talk and warm about not helpful in my opinion and even potentially harmful trends going on in the community itself. Now I don't know about the latest state of discussions, but here are some myths that in my opinion have been repeated a few too many times. First one, more power equals better endgame. Second, quality of life additions will fix the problems of the game. Third, adding new content will solve the problems of the game. Fourth, more content after level 100 will fix the endgame. And fifth, inclusion of target farming in the endgame will fix the game. In order to realize whether or not these 5 hypothetical assumptions would fix Diablo 4, I want to briefly remind everyone on the concept of soured milk we talked about in the first part, and therefore define the background for a good criticism versus bad criticism that we can apply. In my opinion, good criticism starts from zero. No previous experiences, nothing to compare with, or in the very least it doesn't take into consideration previously created expectations, molds and standards. In other words, criticism should become from the standpoint as if the game is its own of unique thing, its own kind. So, what are the problems of Diablo 4, i.e. the things that stand out when playing the game for a longer time? I believe we've already established one of them in Part 1. Diablo 4 does not respect players' efforts properly, as often injects those bits of unaccounted sources of power. I understand that they are there to make the game easier to get hooked up with for some new blood. However, it is also a bad bargain, because it's also throwing the others under the bus. The next big problem is also obvious. Activity on the long run is too repetitive. Nightmare dungeon after nightmare dungeon, one after another. In fact, it's the only thing to do, and if not doing it, you might even risk lagging behind. So there is an obvious need to fix that, and no, I don't think that adding something else would resolve this, but actually redesigning the concept of nightmare dungeons, or at least reward system, is required. The other problem that has been noticed is precision via comparison of pieces' powers. Not talking about builds or skills here, I'm talking about mechanics and gear affixes rather. Critical hit versus lucky hit versus overpower, synergies between them, and etc. To be fair, there is already an announcement regarding some changes for this, and I really hope that Season 2 gets better and perhaps even gets the job done. Then along comes another problem in the endgame, resulting in even more repetitiveness via item drops. I believe that this may be attributed to the fact that the game's release may have been rushed. However, it's also obvious that in the last 30 or so levels, items always roll the same affixes, and the only thing you really look for are the roll percentages and IP numbers. And lastly but not the least, I'll personally add one more problem to the mix, mostly regarding the fact that mob engagement impact does not diverge enough. Before we examine the myths from the community, I want to expand a bit on my initial hot take here, in which I claimed that ARPGs, or at least Diablo for that matter, isn't going in the right direction. I believe that the most important, if not solely important, goal for the endgame should be providing the players with meaningful bits of struggles. Notice the meaning of the word meaningful here. Speaking on the topic meaningful struggles, I think that I'll come with one more layer of thought regarding human nature. Perhaps not related to the sour milk concept from above. I tend to believe that there is something to keep in mind regarding choices. It is a well-known psychological fact that the only way to have a meaningful choice is being provided with 3 or more options. I would also argue that the same applies when it comes to negative outcomes, i.e. pick your poison types. Right now, as we saw in the 2 battle comparison videos once again, side by side, we can come to a conclusion that the only and single point of struggle in Diablo 4 comes from the fact that whether or not you have enough damage output of any kind. One more thing, before we get to part 2, I'll also give a small, perhaps slightly controversial claim here. I think that the closest soulmate, quote-unquote, game for Diablo 4 is not Diablo 3, nor Diablo 2, nor any other ARPG for that matter. I think that its closest soulmate was originally Doom Eternal. At least that's what it felt to me when I played it for the first time. Don't think that the original authors and designers of the game had the goal nor the intention in mind to provide yet another typical ARPG game, but rather give something different to the player. Something that is not reward first, reward centric, or reward based experience as a result, which in terms of going forward fixing Diablo 4 is going to be a hard climb. Namely, I still believe that there is some identity crisis behind. But I'll also argue that precisely that curse might be its biggest blessing in disguise. As you may or may have not sensed already, in part 2 I'm going to focus on examining the myths from the community, one by one, but I'll also talk about the things that Diablo 4 does better already than other games in the genre, and shouldn't crumble under the pressure for pursuit of publicity runs. Don't worry though, in part 3 we'll do the full justice of criticism and do the full circle, attempting to give the actual improvements that Diablo 4 can make and be felt in the right direction, including the always hot topic of itemization.